inevitable.
We've seen countless MCU villains in the MCU of all shapes and sizes, but you know the one thing they have in common? They all lose. Every one of them has ultimately failed in their grand plan thanks to the heroes standing in their way. But have you ever stopped to fully analyze a villain's plan to see what they actually wanted and how feasible it was? Well, that's why we're here today and we're putting a special spotlight on the Mad Titan himself. What was Thanos' actual plan and how did it fall apart? Let's get into it right now. I think what made Thanos so appealing was how you could understand where he was coming from. Yeah, none of us agreed that the best solution to overpopulation would be to set out on a path of death and destruction to find 6 stones that would wipe out half the universe. But how many times have you been stuck at the DMV or caught in bumper-to-bumper traffic and thought to yourself, maybe Thanos had the right idea? It's fascinating to think about, but have you ever stopped to truly try to get to the bottom of Thanos' psyche? And why he would stop at nothing in order to accomplish his goal? Well, let's start with what drove the Mad Titan. To him, his home planet was a paradise. But according to Thanos, it had the same problem as everywhere. Too many mouths to feed that eventually destroyed itself. And on the surface, you could see Thanos' pursuit of wiping out half the galaxy as a way to make up for the failure of Titan. But you know what? I think it's a little bit more selfish than that. Listen to Thanos' speech to Doctor Strange in Infinity War again. Yes, he talks about the destruction of Titan, but he also mentions how he had warned all of Titan about the impending destruction and offered the solution of wiping out half the population in pure random chance. Of course, Titan didn't go for it. I do really want to see how Thanos pitched this though. You think Titan had like an open forum planet council meeting and Thanos arrived with a PowerPoint presentation in order to get his message out? I'd like to think so. So I would actually argue that Thanos' motivation for questing after the Infinity Stones and wiping out half the universe is not mainly driven by his desire to protect the universe from what happened on Titan, no matter how often he says it. I think he's actually driven by the desire to be proven right. He presented a solution to Titan, they scoffed at it, Titan destroyed itself. So now on a grander scale, he's proving to all the naysayers on Titan that his method of dealing with the incoming crisis is effective. Because although this might be explored more in the Eternals movie, Thanos had a rough young childhood. In the comics, his purple appearance is because he had the deviant gene, which made him a bit of an outcast and looked down on by his people. So imagine that for your whole life you're made fun of or feel inferior to the people around you. Then there's a problem and you've come up with a solution and yet they still don't listen to you. Sure, it's a crazy idea that no sane group would listen to, but that didn't matter to Thanos. He was still ignored by people who always hated him, and now here is his chance to prove that he was right all along. Then Thanos isn't some martyr burdened with a glorious purpose who reluctantly will kill half the universe to save the rest, but something else entirely. Food for thought, right? So let's next take a look at Thanos' actual villain plan. We'll highlight what worked, what didn't work, and get to the bottom of some boneheaded decisions Thanos ended up making. We know that in his journey to get all the stones, he obtained the Mind Stone first in the form of the scepter. Now, a lot has been said about why Thanos would give Loki the scepter when it had an Infinity Stone in it, and yeah, the logical answer is,
So he's an idiot.
But if you want to try to craft meaning here, we know the Mind Stone can corrupt those around them. It's been said that Loki wasn't necessarily as evil as he appeared in Avengers, but rather the scepter was corrupting him a bit. If Thanos knew that the Mind Stone had corrupting influences, it makes sense that he wouldn't keep it around him, thus why he gave it to Loki to borrow. Of course, this was the start of a big problem Thanos seemed to have in the MCU. Betrayals. Yes, Loki in Avengers didn't exactly betray Thanos, but you know he totally would have. And then over the next few years, Thanos was betrayed by Ronan, Gamora, and Nebula. Basically, everyone he sent after an Infinity Stone ended up betraying him, until he eventually had to do it himself. And I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, it's definitely just because from a production side, you couldn't have Thanos go himself to get the stones right away, or else the story would be over too quickly and we needed like 30 movies first. But if you justify it as Thanos didn't really want all the Infinity Stones right away, but rather wanted to know where they all were so that he could do one big attack starting with the destruction of Xandar, then that makes a bit more sense. It then paints Thanos as not just a villain that writers couldn't use until Infinity War, but rather someone who had an actual plan throughout all the phases of the MCU. Because it was a pretty easy cakewalk to get the 1-2-3 combo of the Power Stone, the Space Stone, and the Reality Stone. Say if Thanos got the Power Stone right away. At that point, the Space Stone would still be on Asgard, and Thanos may not have wanted to waste his army attacking both Xandar and Asgard so close to each other. Or he didn't want to divert too much time fighting both Xandar and Asgard, giving time for someone to hide the Reality Stone away from the Collector. So basically, Ragnarok was the big key here. Once Asgard was destroyed, then Thanos knew he could decimate Xandar, find the Space Stone among the ruins of the Asgardians, and then basically use the Space Stone to get to nowhere to get the Reality Stone. When you think of it like that, it's a pretty smart plan. So then all that was left to plan for was the Time Stone, the Mind Stone, and the Soul Stone. And Thanos knew all along that the Mind Stone and Time Stone were on Earth and weren't really going anywhere, so he could wait on those. Though Thanos did probably get a little lucky here. He sent in his Black Order to get the Time Stone and the Mind Stone practically simultaneously. And even though his goal of getting the Time Stone off planet technically failed, Iron Man and Doctor Strange decided to keep going to face Thanos on Titan rather than turn back to defend on Earth. Strategically, not the best idea. Yes, I get Tony's thinking of wanting to catch Thanos by surprise, but is that really better than going home and helping mount a proper defensive strategy with the rest of the Avengers? Maybe if the team wasn't broken up, they would have considered turning back. Or maybe they should have considered, hey, we're in space right now, we should check to see if our friend Thor is okay, instead of trying to fly straight at Thanos. In the end, though, everything actually worked out great for Thanos. He was given the Time Stone, he sacrificed his daughter to get the Soul Stone, and then all that was left was a pretty easy-ish fight to get to Vision to rip the Mind Stone out of his head. But Thanos was lucky that Thor was just as arrogant as him and threw the axe in his chest rather than going for his head. And with that, Thanos did the one thing that most MCU villains never get: the chance to get what they wanted. Thanos won. So Thanos represents an extremely rare villain in that he got almost exactly what he wanted and then had to face those consequences. He was able to snap his fingers, randomly dust half the universe, then enjoy a sunset as he woke up to, as he said, a grateful universe. He even snapped his fingers again to destroy the stones for good, making it so it was almost impossible to undo everything. Of course, Thanos didn't have to snap his fingers again and go through that whole ordeal. All he really needed to do was to do something outside the sacred timeline so that the TVA would swoop in and use the Infinity Stones as shiny new paperweights. But anyway, Thanos got what he wanted for 5 years. But surprise, things didn't go quite as Thanos foresaw. He thought the universe would ultimately come to see this as a great gift and a necessary sacrifice, but of course, that didn't happen. Steve even said some people move on, but not us. 5 years later, they developed a plan to fix everything, and they decided to go for it. But seriously, what did Thanos really expect here? When most villains are after a goal, they never achieve it because the hero stopped them. But isn't it fascinating to examine the after effects of a successful villain plan? All those bad guys who want world domination, okay, what happens after 5 years? Things would get a little boring. But I think in those instances where a villain is faced with success and they get to accomplish whatever self-righteous goal they were after, the facade eventually peels away, revealing how dark and twisted the person actually is. Take Thanos, for example. Yes, the OG Thanos didn't technically get to see the ramifications of his plan. His head was separated from his shoulders before that could happen, but 2014 Thanos could see it, and it clearly wasn't what was expected. All his talk about knowing what he was doing was right, and that only he could be burdened with such a task was kind of all baloney, wasn't it? He turned so quickly into a I will remake the world into my own image type of villain that you could only imagine that that personality was there the whole time, bubbling just slightly beneath the surface, hiding behind a facade of martyrdom. And actually, I think this was a solid storytelling choice. I know a lot of fans were disappointed that the three-dimensional, maybe right characterization of Thanos in Infinity War was replaced with a basic destroy everything type of villain in Endgame. But I think in a way it makes sense. 2014 Thanos just saw that his whole life's purpose wasn't going to work out and people would still oppose him. So of course he wanted to go all scorched earth on the Avengers' butts. But overall, one thing I do wish was that OG Thanos was alive for all of this, because as much as it was satisfying and shocking to see Thor cut off Thanos' head, only for a past version of Thanos to be an issue, how interesting would it have been for OG Thanos to be the one who has to try to prevent the Avengers from undoing his work? I just think that's a whole different perspective. Thanos' ultimate plan was incredibly detailed and required years of prep work, and although we all thought his motivations were one thing, I think they turned out to be something else entirely. Now, does that make him a more or less interesting villain? That's the big question. Maybe Thanos' ultimate plan was actually just to become a farmer and this was his way of doing it? I wonder what farmer Thanos was growing. Alien corn? Alien peaches? Look, I know there's a lot of Disney shows, but a 4-episode animated show about Farmer Thanos? Yeah, sign me up.